Hi, I'm Mary Kopczynski, the CEO of RegAlytics, and welcome to the 300th episode of the Regulatory Roundup. This week, there were 29,901 regulatory alerts. You know, I started these updates before the pandemic, during the end of the last Trump administration, and I used to actually type out the script and then cut it into these little strips, and I would tape it to my screen, and I tried really hard to look like I wasn't reading. I also used to try to cram about 25 completely unrelated updates into a 5-minute period. Now you're lucky if I cover more than 3 because I have learned less is more. In fact, I remember back in the day, in the early days, I thought alerts from states asking for disaster assistance was unusual or unprecedented until I realized they do it for just about any storm or flood, and it's a regular part of the drumbeat of regulatory information. So I cleared them from my queue as officially boring. But recently I thought, wait, I wonder how that has trended over time, because we do have a new president in office. We're walking into peak storm season and wildfire season. He's cutting back the federal government like crazy, and apparently he wouldn't even call Governor Walz over the assassination of state legislators because, quote, he's a mess. So I wondered, are disaster declarations getting approved? Which leads to our regulator of the week, which is FEMA. And the topic of the week is disaster declarations. So here in the U.S., if a state declares an emergency, let's say a hurricane or flood, the state is supposed to use its own funding to solve the problem. But where the funding exceeds the state abilities to resolve, the state can request a federal disaster declaration. They do this through FEMA, which then produces a preliminary damage assessment. FEMA then makes a recommendation to the president, and if the president approves the request, a major disaster declaration is issued, which then authorizes federal assistance programs to help individuals and communities to recover. And this can include funding for temporary housing, home repairs, public infrastructure, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the SBA has special powers to support businesses and nonprofits with disaster loans at their own discretion, regardless of a major disaster declaration. And typically this is when, let's say, the Department of Agriculture separately deems some sort of agricultural disaster. So I took all the regulatory alerts since 2020 having to do with disaster alerts, and I reviewed them, of course, using AI, so this is a ballpark number, but there were about 10,000 regulatory alerts in that time. And through that process, I was able to compare Trump 1 versus Biden versus Trump 2. But then I discovered a FEMA site that has all of the FEMA requests since 1953 and whether they were promoted to major disaster or kept as an emergency. And wow. First of all, I asked GPT to match it up with the president, and it gave me a lovely, very, very well-reasoned response as to what the different trends were. But when I looked at the underlying data, it got the dates wrong and attributed disaster declarations with the wrong president. So I had to clean up the data, but this is your official reminder. Verify. You still cannot yet blindly send things from GPT without reading it and understanding if it is based on accurate information. Anyway, this is what I discovered in looking at the data. So in the early days, it was very rare for a president to reject a disaster as a major disaster. In fact, Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush accepted all of the disasters that came their way. And in fact, the average request is about 2,000 to 3,000 requests per presidency. And Jimmy Carter was the first president to get bold and rejected a whopping 53% of disaster requests, which is unusual, right? Because you would think it's the Republicans who are focused on fiscal responsibility and reduced federal footprint that they would be the ones to reject. But in fact, it was a Democrat that's the leader in doing it. But then 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina happened, and George W. Bush had over 15,000 requests that came his way during his presidency, and he actually rejected 37% of them. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama had about 7,000 requests each, and they rejected just over 20%. So then we get to Trump 1, which was our COVID years, and he got over 16,000 requests and rejected 44% of them. Biden didn't actually get very many, only about he got exactly 4,478. And he rejected 35% of them. Now we get to the track record so far for Trump 2, which is actually the highest rejection rate per presidency so far at 54%, which is up there with Jimmy Carter. Anyway, interesting stuff. And that's it this week for RegAlytics. We have the global supply chain of the world's regulatory alerts in one very easy to use place. If you need a solution for anything related to regulation, give us a call.